She stood in front of 30 men and made an announcement that would change everything. $50 to any man who could ride her husband's wild stallion. 23 men had already tried. 23 men had failed. Some said the horse was cursed. Some said it should be shot. But Catherine Sterling knew the truth. Tempest was not waiting to be broken. He was waiting for someone worthy of his trust. Then a stranger rode in from nowhere. A man with haunted eyes and hands that knew horses the way most men know nothing. He did not grab a rope. He did not rush the corral. He just stood there, waiting, until the wildest horse in 3 counties walked up and lowered his head. But earning the horse's trust was the easy part, because the most powerful man in the territory was coming for Catherine's land. He had already forged her dead husband's signature. He had already bought the judges, and when she refused to surrender, he burned her ranch to the ground. Stay until the very end, because this story will show you that some things are stronger than fire. This story teaches us that trust cannot be forced. It must be earned. It reminds us that the people who try to control through fear will always lose to those who lead with patience and respect. Sometimes the wildest hearts are just waiting for someone brave enough to understand them. And sometimes the battles we think we are fighting alone are the ones that bring us the partners we need most. If this story set your soul on fire, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever found strength you did not know you had when everything seemed lost? I would love to hear your story. Hit that like button if you believe trust is worth more than fear. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds you what you are capable of. Share this with someone who needs to know that some things cannot be bought, stolen, or burned. Your share might be exactly what lights their fire today. Catherine Sterling stood on the wooden porch of the general store in Dry Creek Valley, her boots planted firm against the weathered boards. The afternoon sun beat down hard, turning the dusty street into a ribbon of gold. 30 men gathered around her, some curious, some mocking, all waiting to see what this widow woman had to say. She was not a large woman, 5 feet 4 inches in her stockings, hair the color of autumn wheat pulled back in a practical braid, hands calloused from 3 years of running a ranch alone. But when she spoke, her voice carried like a church bell. "I am only going to say this once," Catherine announced. "So listen well." A few men chuckled. Old Pete Wilson, the blacksmith, crossed his arms and shook his head. Women did not make announcements in the middle of town. Women did not command attention from working men. But Catherine Sterling had stopped caring about what women were supposed to do the day she buried her husband. "I own a stallion named Tempest," she continued. "Some of you have seen him. Most of you have heard the stories. Black as midnight, tall as a church door, wild as the storms that gave him his name." "We have heard the stories all right," shouted Marcus Webb from the back of the crowd. He was a cattle broker who had been trying to buy Catherine's land for 2 years, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes. "We have also heard that Horse has put 15 men in Doc Miller's office this month alone." Catherine did not flinch. 23 men, she corrected, and none of them lasted more than 15 seconds on his back. The crowd murmured. 23 men, some of them the best riders in 3 counties. "My husband was the only man Tempest ever allowed to ride him," Catherine said. Her voice softened just enough to betray the grief she still carried. "Thomas rode that horse like they shared the same heartbeat, like they were 2 halves of the same soul." She paused, letting the memory settle over her like a familiar blanket. "Thomas has been gone 3 years now, and every day since Tempest has waited, watching the horizon, looking for a rider worthy of his trust." "What is your point, Mrs. Sterling?" someone called out. Catherine's chin lifted. Her gray eyes swept across the crowd like a storm front moving in. "My point is this. I am offering $50 to any man who can ride Tempest for 10 minutes. Not break him, not beat him into submission, ride him, the way a true horseman rides a horse." Silence fell over the street. $50 was more than most men made in 6 months, enough to buy land, enough to start a new life, Enough to make fools out of brave men. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd, his expensive boots clicking against the boardwalk. He was a handsome man in the way that rattlesnakes are beautiful, sleek and dangerous. Everyone knew he wanted Catherine's ranch. Some said he wanted Catherine too, though she had refused his proposals 3 times already. $50 is a lot of money, Marcus said, his voice smooth as oil. What happens when someone wins? You planning to sell that horse? Maybe sell the whole ranch while you are at it. Catherine met his gaze without blinking. What I do with my ranch is my business, Mr. Webb, not yours. Not now. Not ever. A few men snickered. Marcus's smile tightened, but he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just asking questions, ma'am. Just looking out for a poor widow woman trying to survive in this hard country. I do not need your protection, Catherine said. I need a rider. A real one. Someone who understands that earning a horse's trust is worth more than earning his fear. She stepped down from the porch and walked through the crowd. Men parted to let her pass, watching her with a mixture of respect and disbelief. This woman had buried a husband, fought off land grabbers, survived 2 drought years, and still stood straight as a fence post. There was something about her that made a man want to either help her or get out of her way. Dr. Samuel Miller caught up with her at the edge of town. He was a kind man in his 50s with gray hair and gentle hands that had patched up more cowboys than he could count. Catherine, he said, falling into step beside her, are you sure about this? 23 injured men in 1 month. My wife says I should start charging you rent for my examination room. Catherine almost smiled. Almost. I am sure, Samuel. There is someone out there who can ride him. Thomas always said so. He said Tempest was waiting for the right soul to find him. And if no one comes? Catherine looked toward the mountains where the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the peaks. Then I keep waiting, she said. Just like Tempest. What Catherine did not say, what she could not say, was that time was running out. Marcus Webb had friends in the territorial government. Friends who were looking for any excuse to declare her ranch abandoned or mismanaged. Friends who could take everything she had worked for and hand it over to a man who saw land only as something to be bought and sold. She had 6 months, maybe less. If she could not prove that Tempest was a valuable breeding stallion, if she could not show that her ranch was profitable and well run, she would lose it all. The challenge was not just about finding a rider. It was about saving her home. Miles away, in a 1-room lined shack at the far edge of the Double Bar Ranch, a man named Jake Morrison stared into a dying fire. The flames had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows across the rough wooden walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grass like a secret being passed from one blade to the next. Jake was 34 years old, though the lines on his face made him look older. He had fought in the war, seen things that still visited him in his dreams, done things he wished he could forget. When the fighting ended, he had drifted west, looking for something he could not name. Peace, maybe, or just distance from the man he used to be. He found work on ranches, fixing fences and checking cattle in the far pastures. Jobs that kept him away from people. Jobs that let him live with his silence. But lately, something had been stirring inside him. A restlessness he did not understand. A feeling that he was waiting for something, though he did not know what. The story of Catherine Sterling's challenge reached him 3 days after she made it. A drifter passing through mentioned it while sharing Jake's fire for the night. Crazy woman, the drifter said, chewing on a piece of dried beef. Offering $50 to ride some demon horse. Says she wants someone who can earn its trust. Like a horse cares about trust. Jake did not answer. But something in the story caught hold of him and would not let go. A horse that waited. A woman who believed. A challenge that had nothing to do with breaking, and everything to do with understanding. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. And in the quiet space between sleep and waking, he heard a voice, not with his ears, with something deeper. "Come find me." By morning, he had made his decision. He saddled his bay gelding, Copper, and packed light. A bedroll, some hardtack, a canteen, and a heart that had finally learned to want something again, though he did not yet know what. The ride to Dry Creek Valley took half a day. The land changed as he traveled, rolling from open grassland to rocky mesas, then dipping down into valleys lined with cottonwood trees. Jake felt the air shift before he heard the sound. A scream, wild and fierce and beautiful. Tempest's voice echoed across the valley like the cry of a king defending his throne. And somewhere deep in his chest, Jake Morrison felt an answer rise up to meet it. He was going to ride that horse. He did not know yet that riding the horse would be the easy part. The hard part would be everything that came after. The Sterling Ranch sat in a wide bowl of green land protected by hills on 3 sides and a creek running along the 4th. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Up close, it looked like a place that had been fighting to survive. Jake noticed the small details as he rode in. Fences that needed mending, a barn roof with missing shingles, a vegetable garden that was well tended but too small to feed more than 1 or 2 people. This was a ranch being held together by willpower and little else. The corral stood at the center of the property, and that was where the crowd had gathered. 30 or 40 people lined the fence, watching something inside. Jake could hear their murmurs, their gasps, their groans of disappointment. He tied Copper to a post near the water trough and walked toward the noise. Inside the corral, a man was picking himself up from the dust. His shirt was torn, his hat was crushed. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye. He stumbled toward the fence, helped along by 2 friends who had climbed in to drag him out. And standing in the center of the corral, snorting and pawing at the ground, was the most magnificent horse Jake had ever seen. Tempest. The stallion was everything the stories had promised and more. Black as a moonless night. 17 hands tall, at least. Muscles that rippled under his coat like water over river stones. Eyes that burned with intelligence and fire and something else. Something that looked almost like grief. Jake understood that look. He had seen it in his own reflection often enough. 24 down, someone near Jake muttered. That horse is going to kill somebody before this is over. Good riddance, another voice answered. Horse like that ought to be shot. Jake turned toward the speaker. A young cowboy, maybe 20 years old, with the kind of arrogance that came from never having been truly tested. You ever been shot? Jake asked quietly. The cowboy blinked. What? I asked if you have ever been shot. Ever had a bullet tear through your flesh? Ever laid in the mud wondering if you were going to die? The cowboy's face went pale. He shook his head. Then maybe, Jake said, you should not talk about shooting things you do not understand. He turned back to the corral without waiting for an answer. The cowboy said nothing else. Inside the corral, Tempest had stopped pawing. He stood very still now, his head turned toward Jake, his dark eyes fixed on the stranger who had just spoken in his defense. Jake felt that gaze like a physical touch, like the horse was looking straight through his skin, reading the story written on his bones. You. The voice came from behind him. A woman's voice, clear and strong. Jake turned. Catherine Sterling stood 3 feet away, studying him with the same intensity her horse had shown. Up close, she was more striking than he had expected. Not beautiful in the soft, fragile way that some men preferred. Beautiful like a storm is beautiful. Like a blade is beautiful. Strong and sharp and forged by fire. Me, Jake agreed. You are not from around here. No, ma'am. Where are you from? Jake considered the question. It had been a long time since anyone had asked. Virginia, originally, then Kansas, then Colorado, Then, wherever the work took me. What kind of work? The quiet kind. Fences, cattle, horses sometimes. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. You handle horses? When they let me. She was silent for a moment, measuring him the way a banker measures a man asking for a loan. Finally, she nodded toward the corral. You thinking about trying your luck with Tempest? Jake looked at the stallion. Tempest was still watching him, ears forward, body tensed but not aggressive, waiting. Not luck, Jake said. Never much believed in luck. Then what do you believe in? He thought about it. The question deserved an honest answer. I believe that horses know things people have forgotten, he said. I believe they can see what we try to hide, and I believe that if you want a horse to trust you, you have to be worth trusting. Catherine's expression changed, just slightly, a softening around the eyes that she probably did not even notice. What is your name? Jake Morrison. Well, Mr. Morrison. She gestured toward the corral gate. Let us see if Tempest agrees with your philosophy. Jake did not move toward the gate. Instead, he walked along the fence until he found a spot where Tempest could see him clearly. Then he stopped, rested his arms on the top rail, and waited. The crowd watched, confused. Where was the rope? Where was the rush to climb in and prove himself? That was how the other men had done it, fast and aggressive and full of false confidence. But Jake just stood there, breathing slow, letting Tempest look his fill. Minutes passed. 3, 5, 7. The crowd grew restless. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else said this was a waste of time. But Catherine watched in silence. And Tempest watched in silence. And Jake stood still as a stone, patient as the earth itself. Then Tempest moved, not charging, not threatening, just walking. Slow, deliberate steps that brought him closer to the fence where Jake stood. Closer, closer, until only 3 feet separated them. The stallion stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring, breathing in Jake's scent. Jake did not move, did not reach out, did not speak. He just let the horse learn him. Another minute passed. Then Tempest did something that made the entire crowd gasp. He lowered his head, just a few inches, just enough to signal something that every horseman in that valley understood. Acceptance. Well, Catherine breathed, I will be damned. Jake finally moved. Slowly, carefully, he raised one hand and rested it on Tempest's neck. The stallion's hide was warm under his palm. He could feel the power thrumming through those massive muscles. Power that could have killed him in an instant. But Tempest stood still, and for the first time in 3 years, he let a stranger touch him. You are going to be all right, Jake said softly, words meant only for the horse. I know you have been waiting. I know you have been lonely. I have been waiting too. Tempest's ears twitched forward. He pushed his muzzle against Jake's shoulder, a gentle nudge that was half greeting and half question. Yeah, Jake answered, understanding. I think we might have something to talk about. From her spot by the fence, Catherine watched this exchange with a tightness in her chest that she did not fully understand. She had seen many men approach Tempest. She had watched them swagger and strut and fail. But she had never seen anything like this. This was not a man trying to conquer a horse. This was 2 wounded souls recognizing each other. Mrs. Sterling, the voice cut through her thoughts like a knife through butter. Marcus Webb appeared beside her, his smile firmly in place, his eyes hard as flint. Mr. Webb, she said flatly, I did not see you arrive. Just got here. Heard there was quite a show today. He nodded toward Jake. Who is that? His name is Jake Morrison. Never heard of him. Neither had I. Until about 10 minutes ago. Marcus studied Jake with an expression that Catherine did not like. The kind of expression a man wore when he was calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. "Seems like your horse has taken a shine to him," Marcus observed. "It seems so." "That must make you happy. Finally found someone who can ride your precious Tempest. Maybe now you can sell him. Use the money to pay off those debts I hear you have been struggling with." Catherine's jaw tightened. "My debts are not your concern." "Everything about this valley is my concern, Mrs. Sterling. I am a businessman. I look out for opportunities." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And you, my dear, are running out of time. The Territorial Commission is meeting in 3 months. If you cannot prove your ranch is profitable by then, they will declare it abandoned land, open for purchase, and I will be right there, cash in hand, ready to take it off your hands. Get away from me." Just stating facts." Marcus straightened, adjusting his hat. "But I will tell you what, I am a reasonable man. Marry me, Catherine. Sign the ranch over to my name, and I will make all your problems disappear. You can even keep your horse. I know how much he means to you." Catherine turned to face him fully. Her eyes blazed with a fury that would have made a wiser man step back. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Marcus Webb. I would rather burn this ranch to the ground than see it fall into your hands. I would rather watch every acre turn to dust. And I would rather die alone in the desert than spend one single day as your wife." Marcus's smile did not waver, but something dark flickered in his eyes. Something dangerous. "Careful, Catherine. Pride is a luxury you cannot afford." He tipped his hat. "I will see you at the commission meeting." He walked away, his expensive boots leaving prints in the dust. Catherine watched him go, her hands shaking with rage. She had known Marcus Webb for 5 years, ever since he arrived in Dry Creek Valley with a wagon full of money and a heart full of ambition. He had been buying up land ever since, one struggling ranch at a time, waiting for people to fail, profiting from their desperation. He would not get her land, not while she still had breath in her body. "Trouble?" She turned. Jake had walked to the fence, Tempest following behind him like a dog at its master's heels. "Nothing I cannot handle," she said. Jake studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there, he did not comment on it. He simply nodded. "I would like to try riding him tomorrow," he said. "If that is all right with you. I think we need a little more time to get acquainted first." Catherine blinked. No one had ever asked for more time. Every other challenger had wanted to ride immediately, eager to prove themselves, impatient for the glory. "That will be fine," she said. "You can sleep in the bunkhouse tonight. There is food in the main house if you're hungry." "Thank you, ma'am." He turned back to Tempest, running his hand along the stallion's neck one more time. The horse stood perfectly still, eyes half closed in contentment. And Catherine watched them, this quiet stranger and her wild horse, and felt something stir in her chest, something that had been sleeping for 3 long years, something that felt dangerous, like hope. Morning came soft and gray to the Sterling ranch, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised rain but had not yet delivered. Jake was awake before dawn, sitting on the bunkhouse steps with a cup of coffee, watching the sky lighten from black to purple to pale gold. He had slept better than he had in years. No nightmares, no restless tossing, just deep, dreamless sleep, as if something inside him had finally found rest. Tempest was already awake, too. The stallion stood at the corral fence, watching Jake with those dark, knowing eyes, waiting. "Today," Jake said quietly, as if the horse could hear him across the distance, "today we see what we are made of." By mid-morning, the crowd had gathered again. Word had spread through the valley that the stranger was going to attempt his ride, and people had come from miles around to watch. Some wanted to see him succeed. Most expected him to fail. Catherine stood on the porch of the main house, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had barely slept, her mind churning with worries about Marcus Webb and the commission and the thousand things that could go wrong. But watching Jake walk toward the corral, she felt that strange flicker of hope again. There was something different about him. Something steady and true, like a mountain that did not move no matter how hard the wind blew. Jake reached the corral fence and stopped. Tempest was already there waiting for him. "Morning, partner," Jake said softly. "You ready for this?" Tempest nickered, a low sound that seemed almost like agreement. Jake climbed the fence slowly, giving the horse time to adjust to his presence inside the space. He dropped down onto the packed earth and stood still, letting Tempest come to him. The stallion approached without hesitation this time. He walked right up to Jake and pressed his forehead against the man's chest, a gesture of trust so complete that several people in the crowd murmured in disbelief. "I know," Jake whispered, stroking the horse's neck. "I know you have been hurt. I know you have been alone. But that is over now. You hear me? That is over." He spent the next 30 minutes with Tempest, talking to him, touching him, walking beside him around the corral, building a connection that went deeper than ropes or reins could ever reach. When Jake finally moved toward the saddle, the crowd fell silent. He had brought his own gear from Copper, a simple saddle, well-worn but well-maintained, a bridle with a gentle bit that would not cause pain. He showed each piece to Tempest before putting it on, letting the horse smell the leather, accept each step of the process. Saddling took another 20 minutes. Jake did not rush. He did not force. He simply waited for permission at each stage, and Tempest gave it. Finally, Jake stood beside the saddled horse, one hand on the horn, one foot in the stirrup. "Here we go," he breathed. He swung up into the saddle. Tempest stiffened. His muscles bunched beneath his hide. Every person watching held their breath, waiting for the explosion. It never came. Instead, Tempest stood perfectly still for one heartbeat, 2, 3. Then he stepped forward. The crowd gasped. Someone cheered. Someone else swore in amazement. Jake sat easy in the saddle, his body relaxed, his hands light on the reins. He was not fighting the horse. He was not trying to control him. He was simply riding with him, letting Tempest set the pace. The stallion walked the perimeter of the corral, testing this new sensation. A man on his back, weight that did not hurt, hands that did not punish. After 3 circuits, Tempest lifted into a trot. Jake moved with him, rising and falling in perfect rhythm, his balance so natural it looked like he had been born on horseback. The crowd watched in stunned silence as horse and rider moved together like a single creature. 5 minutes passed. Tempest pushed into a canter. Now the true test began. At this speed, with this much power, any mistake could be fatal. One wrong move from Jake, one moment of tension or fear, and the horse would feel it, would react. But Jake rode like a man who had already faced death and no longer feared it. His body flowed with every movement, anticipating, adjusting, trusting. 8 minutes. Tempest stretched out into a full gallop. Dust rose behind them in golden clouds. The horse's hooves thundered against the earth like war drums. His mane streamed back like black fire. He was running now, truly running, with a joy that had been locked inside him for 3 long years. And Jake rode him through it all. 10 minutes, someone shouted. Jake did not stop, neither did Tempest. They ran together, horse and man, around and around the corral. 11 minutes, 12, 13. Catherine gripped the porch railing so hard her knuckles went white. Tears streamed down her face, though she did not realize she was crying. She had seen this once before, only once, when Thomas rode Tempest on the day they were married. The same joy, the same trust, the same impossible, beautiful union of 2 souls who had found each other. At 15 minutes, Jake finally eased Tempest back. The stallion responded instantly, dropping from gallop to canter to trot to walk. His sides heaved, but his eyes were bright. Alive. When Jake dismounted, his legs trembled, not from fear, from the magnitude of what had just happened. Tempest turned and nudged his shoulder, that same gentle gesture from the day before. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like family. "You did it," Catherine said, her voice shaking as she approached. "You actually did it." Jake looked at her, and for a moment the walls around his heart felt thin as paper. "He did it," Jake corrected. "I just went along for the ride." Catherine laughed, a sound that surprised even her. It had been so long since she had laughed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. $50, she said. "You earned it." Jake looked at the pouch. Then he looked at Catherine. Then he looked around the ranch, at the broken fences and the tired buildings and the signs of struggle everywhere. "Keep it," he said. "What?" "I said keep it. I did not come here for money." Catherine stared at him. "Then why did you come?" Jake thought about the question. He thought about the years of wandering, the loneliness, the feeling of being lost in his own life. He thought about the moment he heard Tempest's cry across the valley. "I came because I was supposed to," he said finally. "I do not know how else to explain it." Catherine was silent for a long moment. The crowd had begun to disperse, talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, but she barely noticed them. All her attention was focused on this strange, quiet man who had done the impossible. "I cannot pay you much," she said at last, "but I could use help around here. The ranch is falling apart, and I have been trying to hold it together alone for too long." Jake looked at the fences, the barn, the fields, work that needed doing, purpose that needed filling. "All right," he said. "All right. I will stay. For a while at least. See if I can be useful." Catherine extended her hand. Jake took it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from hard work. "Welcome to the Sterling Ranch, Mr. Morrison." Jake, just Jake. Catherine, just Catherine. They shook hands, and something passed between them. Something neither of them was ready to name. Tempest watched from the corral, his ears forward, his eyes knowing. The horse understood what the humans did not. This was only the beginning. That night, Jake repaired the bunkhouse stove, which had been broken for months. Catherine cooked dinner, simple fare of beans and cornbread and salt pork. They ate together on the main house porch, watching the stars appear one by one. "Your husband," Jake said carefully, breaking a long but comfortable silence. "What kind of man was he?" Catherine set down her fork. "Thomas was a dreamer. He saw this land and imagined what it could be, a breeding ranch famous for producing the finest horses in the territory. Tempest was supposed to be the start of that dream. What happened? Sickness. The kind that comes on slow and leaves fast." Her voice was steady, but Jake heard the grief beneath it. One season, he was riding Tempest across these hills, strong as an oak. The next, he could barely stand. By winter, he was gone. "I am sorry. I have had 3 years to make peace with it. Some days are harder than others." She looked at Jake, her gray eyes reflecting starlight. "What about you? What ghosts do you carry?" Jake was quiet for a moment. He had not talked about the war. Not to anyone. But sitting here in the darkness, with this woman who had survived her own battles, the words came easier than he expected. "I fought in the war," he said. "Did things I am not proud of. Saw things that do not leave you. When it ended, I did not know who I was anymore. The man I had been before seemed like a stranger. So you ran. I would not call it running, more like searching, trying to find something worth living for. Did you find it?" Jake looked at the corral where Tempest's dark shape moved through the shadows. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe I am starting to." Catherine did not push for more. She understood that some truths took time to emerge, like water seeping up through deep soil. They sat together in silence, watching the night deepen around them. Two damaged people, beginning to heal. 2 weeks passed, and Jake fell into the rhythm of ranch life like a man coming home after a long journey. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, and fell into dreamless sleep each night. The fences got mended, the barn roof got patched. The vegetable garden expanded to 3 times its original size, and every morning, without fail, he spent an hour with Tempest. The stallion had transformed. The wild fire in his eyes was still there, but it burned cleaner now, purposeful. He followed Jake around the ranch like a massive black shadow, watching everything, trusting everything. "You have done something remarkable," Catherine said one evening, watching Jake brush Tempest's coat until it gleamed. "I never thought I would see him like this again." "He just needed someone to listen," Jake said. "Most of us do." Catherine opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut her off. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Even from a distance, Jake recognized the lead figure. Marcus Webb sat tall on an expensive bay mare, flanked by 2 men who had the look of hired muscle. "Trouble," Jake said quietly. "He has been coming around more often lately," Catherine said, her voice tight. "Ever since the commission set their deadline." Jake handed her the brush. "Stay here. This is my land, my fight." "I know, but let me stand with you." Something in his tone made her pause. She nodded. They walked together to meet the riders. Marcus Webb reined in his horse and smiled down at them, that smooth, dangerous smile that never touched his eyes. "Good evening, Catherine. And Mr. Morrison, I believe. The horse whisperer everyone has been talking about." "What do you want, Marcus?" Catherine asked. "Just a friendly visit. Wanted to see how things were progressing out here. The commission meeting is only 10 weeks away, you know. Time flies." "I am well aware of the deadline." "Good, good." Marcus dismounted, brushing dust from his expensive coat. "I also wanted to deliver some news. Thought you should hear it from a friend." "You are not my friend." Marcus's smile flickered. "Fine. From a neighbor, then." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I have been doing some research. Turns out your late husband had some debts that were never properly settled. Debts that were transferred to you upon his death." Catherine's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "Thomas borrowed money from the Territorial Bank 2 months before he died. Quite a substantial sum. He used it to purchase new breeding stock, I believe. Unfortunately, he passed before he could make good on the loan." "That is impossible. Thomas never mentioned any loan." "Perhaps he did not want to worry you. Men do that sometimes, trying to protect their women from harsh realities." Marcus unfolded the paper. "The bank recently decided to call in the debt. With interest, you owe them $800, payable immediately." Jake saw Catherine's knees nearly buckle. $800 was more than the ranch was worth. It was an impossible sum. "This has to be a mistake," Catherine whispered. "No mistake. The documents are all in order." Marcus tucked the paper away. "Of course there is a solution. The bank is willing to accept the ranch as payment. You sign over the deed, the debt disappears, and you walk away free and clear. Walk away from my home, my husband's dream. It is just land, Catherine, just dirt and fences and a broken-down barn. You could start fresh somewhere else, find a new life." Jake stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of stone. "The lady said she did not want your help." Marcus turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. "This does not concern you, Mr. Morrison. You are just hired help." "Maybe so. But I know a vulture when I see one. And I know what it looks like when a man creates problems just so he can offer solutions." A dangerous silence fell over the yard. "Be careful," Marcus said softly. "I am not a man you want as an enemy." "Neither am I." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Marcus laughed, a cold sound without humor. "Have it your way. But remember what I said, Catherine. The debt is real. The deadline is real. And when you lose everything, I will be there to pick up the pieces." He mounted his horse. "Good evening to you both." The three riders wheeled around and galloped away, leaving dust hanging in the air like a bad omen. Catherine stood frozen, her face ashen. Jake touched her arm gently. "Come inside," he said. "We need to talk." In the kitchen, Jake poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he found on the top shelf. Catherine accepted hers with shaking hands. "It cannot be real," she said. "Thomas would have told me. He told me everything. Maybe he did not have time. You said he got sick fast. But $800? Where would he even get that kind of loan?" Jake sat across from her at the worn wooden table. "What matters now is figuring out if the debt is legitimate. And if it is, finding a way to pay it." "With what?" "I have $17 in the strong box. $17 against 800. "There has to be a way." Catherine laughed bitterly. "You do not understand how things work out here. Marcus Webb owns half the territory. He has judges in his pocket, bankers in his bed, and politicians on his payroll. If he says I owe the money, I owe the money. Then we find the proof ourselves. Go to the bank, look at the original documents, see if anything does not add up. And if everything does add up," Jake met her eyes, "then we figure out another way. I did not come this far to watch you lose everything." Something in his voice made Catherine pause. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the steel beneath the quiet surface. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "You have known me 2 weeks. This is not your fight." Jake was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely showed. "I spent 10 years running from everything," he said. "Running from the war. Running from myself. Running from any place that started to feel like home. I told myself it was easier that way. Safer. But all I did was build walls around emptiness." He reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold against his palm. "Then I came here. I met Tempest. I met you. And for the first time in a decade, I stopped running. I do not know what that means yet. I do not know where this is going. But I know I'm not leaving. I'm not. Not while you need help. Not while there is still a fight to be won." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink them away, but one escaped and rolled down her cheek. "Thomas said something to me once," she whispered. "He said that life sends us the people we need exactly when we need them. I never believed it. Until now." Jake squeezed her hand. "We will figure this out together, whatever it takes." Late that night, after Catherine had finally gone to bed, Jake sat on the bunkhouse steps with Tempest standing nearby in the darkness. The stallion seemed to sense his mood, staying close but quiet. "We have got a problem, partner," Jake murmured. "A big one." Tempest nickered softly. "Marcus Webb thinks he can take everything. Thinks he can push until there is nothing left to push against." Jake's jaw tightened. "But he does not know me. And he sure as hell does not know Catherine." The stallion stepped closer, resting his great head against Jake's shoulder. "We are going to save this ranch," Jake said. "No matter what it takes. You hear me? No matter what." Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. The sound echoed across the valley, lonely and wild. Jake did not flinch. He had heard worse sounds in worse places, and he had survived them all. He would survive this too. They both would. The ride to town took 2 hours. Jake and Catherine left at dawn, reaching Dry Creek Valley just as the general store opened its doors. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. The Territorial Bank sat at the end of Main Street, a squat brick building with iron bars on the windows. Jake tied the horses outside while Catherine took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "Ready?" Jake asked. "No, but let us do it anyway." The bank manager was a thin man named Horace Whitfield, with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his fingers. He looked nervous when Catherine and Jake walked into his office. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, rising from his desk, "I was not expecting you." "I imagine not. I want to see the loan documents, the ones Marcus Webb says my husband signed." Whitfield's face went pale. "That is highly irregular. Bank documents are confidential. They concern my property and my finances. I have a right to see them." "Perhaps you should consult a lawyer." Jake stepped forward. "Perhaps you should show us the documents before we start asking questions that might make certain people uncomfortable." Something in his tone made Whitfield swallow hard. He glanced toward the door, then back at them. "Very well," he said at last. "But this stays between us. If Marcus Webb finds out I let you see these records, there will be consequences." He disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a leather folder. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the desk. Catherine opened the folder and began to read. The documents looked legitimate at first glance. A loan agreement dated 4 months before Thomas died. $800 borrowed against the ranch property. Thomas's signature at the bottom, bold and confident. But something nagged at Catherine, something wrong. "This date," she said slowly. "September 14th, 1870. "Yes, ma'am. The day the loan was issued. When Thomas was in Denver on September 14th, we both were. We had taken the train for our anniversary. He could not have signed this document in person." Whitfield's face went even paler. "I am sure there is an explanation. The explanation is that this signature is forged." Jake leaned over her shoulder, studying the document. "Look at the ink. It is too dark, too fresh. A 3-year-old document should show some fading. Mr. Morrison, please. These are serious accusations." "Yes, they are." Catherine stood, her gray eyes blazing with fury. "Marcus Webb created this debt. He forged my husband's signature. He has been planning to steal my land since before Thomas even died." "I cannot speak to that," Whitfield stammered. "I only process the paperwork I am given." "Who gave you this paperwork?" "I really cannot say." Jake took a step closer to the desk. "Let me ask a different way. Who will be very unhappy if this forgery becomes public knowledge? Who has been pressuring you to make this seem legitimate?" Whitfield looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk and disappear. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Marcus Webb," he whispered. "He brought the documents to me himself. Said they were discovered in old bank records. Said I should process them quietly and there would be a bonus in it for me." "So you knew," Catherine said. "You knew this was false and you went along with it anyway." "I have a family, Mrs. Sterling. A wife, children. Marcus Webb is not a man you refuse. People who cross him have a way of suffering accidents." Jake's voice went cold. "And people who help him have a way of going to prison." Whitfield's face crumbled. For a moment he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. "Take the documents," he said finally. "Take them and go. I will deny everything if asked, but at least you will have proof." Catherine gathered the papers, her hands steady despite the rage boiling inside her. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. You have done the right thing. I hope so, for all our sakes." Checks. Outside the bank, Catherine clutched the folder to her chest like a shield. Her mind was racing, putting together pieces of a puzzle she had not even known existed. "He has been planning this for years," she said, "even before Thomas got sick. Marcus Webb has been planning to take my ranch for years." "Now we know," Jake said. "And now we can fight back." But how? The Territorial Commission is still controlled by men in Webb's pocket. Even with proof of forgery, they might just ignore it. Then we do not take it to the Commission. We take it higher. Catherine looked at him. Higher? There is a federal marshal who passes through this territory every few months. Name of Samuel Hardwick. I met him once years ago when I was working a cattle drive. He is honest, incorruptible. If we can get these documents to him, he will investigate. Do you know where to find him? No, but I know someone who might. That afternoon they rode to a small homestead on the outskirts of the valley. The cabin was rough but well-maintained, surrounded by a garden that spoke of careful hands. An old woman sat on the porch, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp as a hawk's. "Jacob Morrison," she said as they approached. "I wondered when you would find your way back to me." Jake dismounted and walked up the porch steps. He bent down and kissed the old woman on the cheek. "Hello, Mama Rose." Catherine stared. "You know each other?" "Rose helped me when I first came west," Jake explained. "She ran a way station for people who were lost. Not just lost on the trail, lost in their souls." Rose chuckled. "Pretty words for a simple truth. I fed him soup and let him sleep in my barn. The boy was more ghost than man when he showed up." "She brought me back to life," Jake said simply. "I owe her everything." Rose patted his hand. "You owe me nothing, child. But I can see you are in trouble now, both of you. Come inside and tell me what is wrong." Over cups of strong tea, Jake and Catherine explained everything. The forged documents, Marcus Webb's scheme, the looming deadline. Rose listened in silence, her weathered hands wrapped around her cup. "Marcus Webb," she said when they finished. "I have known that snake for 15 years. He killed my son." Catherine gasped. "What?" "Oh, nothing they could ever prove. My boy Daniel refused to sell his water rights to Webb. 3 days later, he was found dead in a ravine. They called it an accident. Said his horse must have spooked." Rose's eyes went dark. "Daniel was the best horseman in 3 counties. His horse did not spook." "I am so sorry," Catherine whispered. "It was a long time ago, but I have been waiting for someone to stand up to that man ever since." Rose reached under her chair and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This is everything I have gathered over the years. Every suspicious death, every questionable land deal, every witness who was willing to talk." "Yes, sir." She handed the journal to Jake. "Take it. Add your evidence to mine. Then find Samuel Hardwick. He makes a stop in Silver Springs every 4 weeks. If you ride fast, you might catch him before he moves on." Jake took the journal with the reverence it deserved. "This could destroy Webb." "That is what I'm counting on." Rose's eyes met his. "Finish what I could not, Jacob. For my son, for Catherine, for everyone that man has hurt." Jake nodded, a promise made without words. "I will." They left for Silver Springs the next morning before the sun had fully risen. Jake rode Copper while Catherine rode Tempest, a sight that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. The Stallion had accepted her completely now, as if her connection to Jake made her family by extension. The journey would take 3 days. 3 days of hard riding through open country, skirting Marcus Webb's territory, avoiding main roads where his men might be watching. On the first night, they camped beside a creek, the water singing softly over stones. Jake built a small fire while Catherine unpacked their provisions. "You should know something," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Going against Marcus Webb means painting a target on your back. Once we give those documents to the marshal, there is no going back. Webb will come for you with everything he has. He is already coming for me. At least this way I have a chance to fight. It could get dangerous." Catherine looked at him across the flames. "I buried my husband. I have run a ranch alone for 3 years. I have survived droughts and predators and men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. Dangerous is nothing new to me." Jake smiled, a rare sight that transformed his weathered face. "I just wanted to make sure you understood." "I understand perfectly, and I am grateful you are here with me." They ate in silence after that, but it was a warm silence, filled with unspoken things. On the second day, trouble found them. They were crossing a rocky pass when the shot rang out. The bullet struck a boulder inches from Catherine's head, spraying stone chips across her face. Tempest reared in alarm. "Down!" Jake shouted, throwing himself from Copper and dragging Catherine off Tempest in one motion. They hit the ground hard, rolling behind a cluster of rocks. More shots followed, kicking up dust and pebbles around them. "How many?" Catherine gasped, her heart pounding. Jake peered over the rocks. 3, maybe 4, positioned up on that ridge. Webb's men? Has to be. He must have had someone watching the roads." Another shot cracked through the air. Jake ducked back down. "Our rifles are in the saddle packs," he said. "All we have are our pistols. We are outgunned. We have been outgunned before." Jake met her eyes, and she saw something there. Not fear, calm calculation. The look of a man who had survived worse situations. "There is a gully about 20 yards to the left," he said. "If we can reach it, we can work around behind them." 20 yards across open ground while they are shooting at us." "You have a better idea?" Catherine did not. She nodded grimly. "On 3, Jake said. 1, 2, 3. They ran. Bullets sang past them so close Catherine could feel the wind of their passing. The 20 yards felt like 20 miles. Every second stretched into an eternity. Then they were diving into the gully, sliding down the sandy slope, pressing themselves against the cool earth. "You hit?" Jake asked, checking her over. "No. You?" "Not yet." They moved through the gully in a crouch, keeping low, using every bit of cover the land offered. Jake led the way, his movement sure and silent, the skills of a soldier returning as if they had never left. 10 minutes later, they had circled behind the ridge where the shooters were positioned. Jake peered up over the edge and counted heads. 4 men, 2 with rifles, 2 with shotguns, spread out along the ridge. "What do we do?" Jake's jaw tightened. "We do what we have to." What happened next was fast and brutal. Jake moved like a ghost, taking the first man down with a chokehold before he could make a sound. Catherine watched in shock, but there was no time for questions. The second man turned at the sound of his partner falling and took Jake's fist across his jaw. He crumpled. The third man saw them and raised his rifle. Catherine drew her pistol and fired without thinking. The shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his weapon and fell. The fourth man ran, just turned and fled down the ridge, disappearing into the scrubland below. Jake let him go. "Let him tell Webb," he said, breathing hard. "Let him know we are coming." They rode hard after that, pushing the horses to their limits. No more stopping, no more rest. Every mile put between them and danger was a mile closer to salvation. On the third day, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they saw Silver Springs, a small town nestled in a valley, peaceful and ordinary, with no idea that 2 desperate riders were bringing a firestorm to its doors. Jake pulled up at the edge of town, his eyes scanning the streets. "The marshal should be at the boarding house if he is here. Rose said he always stays in the same room. And if he has already left? Then we follow him until we catch up." They rode into town side by side, ignoring the curious stares of locals who rarely saw strangers. Jake dismounted outside the boarding house and helped Catherine down from Tempest. "Stay with the horses," he said. "I will check inside." He was gone for 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. When he emerged, his face was grim. Catherine's heart sank. "He is gone?" "No, he is here, but he is not alone." "What do you mean?" Jake's voice was tight. "Marcus Webb got here first. He is in the marshal's room right now. And from what I could hear, he is trying to convince Hardwick that we are the criminals. Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. After everything they had been through, Marcus Webb had outmaneuvered them. He had reached the marshal first, and was spinning his web of lies even now. "We cannot let him do this," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "We have proof. We have Rose's journal. We have the forged documents. Proof means nothing if Webb convinces Hardwick not to listen. Then we make him listen." Before Jake could stop her, Catherine was striding toward the boarding house door. He caught up with her on the stairs, grabbing her arm. "Wait. Think about this. If we burst in there without a plan, Webb will use it against us. He will say we are desperate, dangerous." Exactly what he is probably telling Hardwick right now. "So what do we do?" Jake thought for a moment. Then a slow smile crossed his face. "We do not interrupt. We wait for Webb to leave. And then we let the truth speak for itself." They waited in the shadows of the livery stable across the street, watching the boarding house door. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, Marcus Webb emerged. He looked pleased with himself, that smug smile firmly in place. He adjusted his hat, mounted his horse, and rode out of town without a backward glance. Jake waited until Webb was out of sight before he moved. "Now." They crossed the street and climbed the stairs to room 7. Jake knocked. "Go away." The voice from inside was gruff, tired. "I am done for the day." "Marshal Hardwick? My name is Jake Morrison. I served in the 14th Virginia Infantry. I met you once 8 years ago on a cattle drive outside of Denver." Silence. Then the sound of boots on floorboards. The door opened. Samuel Hardwick was a big man, well over 6 feet, with gray hair cropped short and eyes that had seen everything. He studied Jake for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I remember you. You stopped a stampede single-handed. Saved 3 men's lives. I did what needed doing. Most men do not." Hardwick's gaze moved to Catherine. "And who is this?" "Catherine Sterling. The woman Marcus Webb just spent 2 hours lying to you about." Hardwick's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "He said you would come. He said you were dangerous. Accused you of theft, conspiracy, threatening a bank official." "Did you believe him?" Catherine asked. Hardwick was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come inside. Let me hear your side." They talked for 3 hours. Catherine laid out everything: the forged documents, the fraudulent debt, Marcus Webb's years-long scheme to steal her land. She showed Hardwick Rose's journal, page after page of evidence pointing to Webb's crimes. Jake filled in the details Rose had gathered: the suspicious deaths, the intimidated witnesses, the pattern of corruption that stretched across the entire territory. When they finished, Hardwick sat in silence, studying the documents spread across his table. His face was unreadable. "This is serious," he said at last. "If what you are telling me is true, Marcus Webb has committed fraud, forgery, and possibly murder. He has corrupted local officials and manipulated the territorial government." "It is all true," Catherine said. "Every word." "I believe you." Hardwick looked up. "But belief is not proof. What you have here is compelling. But a good lawyer could argue that Rose's journal is hearsay. The forged documents are damning, but Webb will claim they were planted." "So he just gets away with it?" Catherine's voice cracked. "He destroys lives, steals land, kills people, and nothing happens?" "I did not say that." Hardwick stood, walking to the window. "I said this evidence alone is not enough. We need more. We need a witness, someone on the inside who is willing to testify." Jake thought about Horace Whitfield, trembling behind his desk. "The bank manager knows the truth. He admitted it to us." "Will he testify in court?" He is terrified of Webb, but he has a conscience. With the right pressure, he might be convinced. Hardwick turned back to face them. Then here is what we do. I cannot arrest Webb based on what you have shown me, but I can open an official investigation. That will buy you time. The Territorial Commission cannot rule on your property while a federal investigation is ongoing. Hope flickered in Catherine's chest. How much time? 6 months. Maybe more. Long enough for us to build a real case. And Webb, he will not just sit idle while you investigate. No, he will not. Hardwick's face was grim. He will come after you harder than ever. You need to understand that. From this moment on, you are in danger. Both of you. Jake stepped forward. We have been in danger since the day we started asking questions. At least now we have a chance to fight back. Hardwick studied him. You really are the same man who stopped that stampede. Most people run from trouble. You run toward it. Only when there is something worth protecting. Jake did not look at Catherine, but she felt his words all the same. Hey. That night they stayed in Silver Springs, sharing a meal at the local saloon. The food was simple, the beer was warm. But sitting across from Jake, Catherine felt something she had not felt in years. Safety. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. For believing me. For staying. Jake set down his mug. I told you. I am not running anymore. But you could. This is not your fight. You have no stake in my ranch. No reason to risk your life. You really believe that? The question hung in the air between them. Catherine met his eyes and saw the answer she had been too afraid to look for. No, she whispered. I suppose I do not. Jake reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm with life. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Agreed? Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back and nodded. Agreed. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the sky like promises. And somewhere in the darkness, a horse nickered softly, as if he too understood that something important had just been said. They returned to the Sterling Ranch 4 days later to find it burned. Not completely. The main house still stood, blackened but intact. The barn was a skeleton of charred beams. The bunkhouse was gone entirely, reduced to ash. Catherine stood in the ruins of her home, her face pale as death. He did this, she whispered. Webb did this while we were gone. Jake walked through the wreckage, checking for survivors, for clues, for anything that might help. He found a message nailed to what remained of the barn door, a single word. Leave. He tore it down before Catherine could see it. The horses? She asked, her voice trembling. Gone. All of them. Tempest? Jake felt his heart clench. He had left Tempest and Copper in town, too tired from the journey to bring them back that night. A choice that had probably saved their lives. Safe. They are both safe. Catherine sank to her knees in the ash. 3 years of work, 3 years of struggle, gone in one night of flames. Jake knelt beside her. We can rebuild. With what? I have nothing left. You have the land. The land cannot burn. It does not matter. Without the barn, without the equipment, without the breeding stock, I cannot prove the ranch is profitable. The commission will rule against me, and Webb will take everything anyway. Jake took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. Marcus Webb wants you to give up. He wants you to lie down and die. That is why he did this, to break you. Maybe I am already broken. No. Jake's voice was fierce. I have seen broken. I have been broken. You are not broken. You are hurt. You are angry, you are scared, but you are still standing. You are still fighting. And as long as you are fighting, you have not lost. Catherine stared at him, tears streaming down her face. How? How do I fight this? We rebuild. Not the buildings, the case. We go to Whitfield and we convince him to testify. We find the other witnesses in Rose's journal. We give Hardwick everything he needs to put Webb behind bars. And if we fail, then we fail together. But we do not quit. Not now. Not ever. For a long moment, Catherine said nothing. Then slowly she reached up and placed her hands over his. Together, she repeated. Together. The next weeks were the hardest of Catherine's life. They set up camp in the damaged main house, patching the roof enough to keep out the rain. Jake rode out every day, tracking down witnesses, gathering evidence, building the case that would destroy Marcus Webb. Catherine worked just as hard. She visited neighbors, old friends, anyone who had ever suffered at Webb's hands. She listened to their stories, wrote down their names, promised them that this time would be different. This time someone would stand up. Not everyone believed her. Some were too scared. Some had already given up. But enough people came forward. Enough truth emerged to make a difference. And through it all, Tempest stood guard. The Stallion had refused to leave Catherine's side since the fire. He slept outside the damaged house, watched every visitor who approached, nickered warnings whenever strangers came near. He had become her protector in ways that went beyond anything Jake had taught him. One night, as Catherine sat on what remained of her porch, Tempest approached and rested his great head in her lap. She stroked his mane, feeling the strength beneath the silk. "You miss Thomas," she said softly. "I know you do. But you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to keep going." Tempest blew out a soft breath, his eyes half closed in contentment. "Thank you," Catherine whispered, "for everything." The confrontation came 6 weeks later. Marcus Webb rode onto the Sterling property at noon, flanked by 6 armed men. He found Jake and Catherine waiting for him, standing side by side in front of the burned barn. "You should have taken my advice," Webb said, his smile gone now, replaced by cold fury. "You should have left when you had the chance." "We are not leaving," Catherine said. "Then you will die here." Webb gestured to his men. "I have 12 witnesses who will swear you set the fire yourself. Insurance fraud, arson. Combined with the bank debt, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. Your witnesses are liars. My witnesses are well paid. That makes them very convincing." Jake stepped forward. "It is over, Webb. Marshal Hardwick has opened a federal investigation. He has testimony from Horace Whitfield, from Rose Delacroix, from a dozen people you have wronged over the years. Your forgeries, your bribes, your threats. It is all documented. It is all coming out." For the first time, something flickered in Webb's eyes. Fear. "You are bluffing." "Try me." Webb's hand moved toward his gun. His men tensed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound broke the silence. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. A dozen riders appeared at the edge of the property. At their head rode Marshal Samuel Hardwick, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. Behind him came the sheriff of Dry Creek Valley and half a dozen deputies. "Marcus Webb," Hardwick called out. "You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. Lower your weapons and surrender." Webb's face twisted with rage. For a moment it looked like he might fight. His men shifted nervously, outnumbered and outgunned. Then the fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped, his hands dropped to his sides. "This is not over," he spat at Catherine. "You think you have won? I have lawyers. I have friends. I will destroy you." Catherine walked up to him, close enough to see the fear in his eyes. "You tried to take everything from me," she said quietly. My land, my home, my husband's dream. But you failed, because some things cannot be bought or stolen or burned. Some things are stronger than fire. She stepped back. Take him away. Hardwick's men moved in. They disarmed Webb's riders, cuffed the man himself, and led them all away. Within minutes, the property was clear. Jake walked up beside Catherine, sliding his arm around her waist. It is over, he said. No. Catherine turned to face him, and for the first time in months, she was smiling. It is just beginning. Spring returned to Dry Creek Valley, bringing with it new grass, new wildflowers, and new hope. The Sterling Ranch was rising from the ashes. Jake had spent the winter rebuilding. A new barn, bigger than the old one. New corrals, stronger than before. New fences stretching across acres of green pasture. He had not done it alone. Neighbors had come, one by one, offering hands and tools and lumber. People who had been afraid of Marcus Webb now stepped forward to help the woman who had brought him down. The ranch that had nearly died was being reborn through community and through love. Catherine watched Jake from the porch, the same porch where she had once sat alone, drowning in grief. He was working on a new gate, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his movements sure and strong. Tempest stood nearby, supervising, occasionally nudging Jake's shoulder when he thought the man was working too slow. She smiled. It still surprised her how easily the smiles came now. You going to stand there watching all day? Jake called without turning around. Or are you going to help? I am thinking about it. He laughed, that rare sound that still made her heart skip. Think faster. This gate is not going to build itself. Catherine walked down the steps and across the yard, letting her hand trail along Tempest's neck as she passed. The stallion nickered softly, content. She reached Jake and wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her face against his back. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For everything. For staying. For fighting. For believing in me when I had forgotten how to believe in myself. Jake set down his hammer and turned to face her. His hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite their roughness. I should be thanking you, he said. You gave me something I never thought I would have again. A home, a purpose, a reason to wake up every morning and be glad I am alive. We gave that to each other. Yeah. His voice was thick with emotion. I suppose we did. He kissed her then, soft and slow, with all the tenderness of a man who had learned that love was worth waiting for. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. There is something I need to ask you, Jake said. Catherine's heart began to beat faster. What? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. It was not fancy, not expensive, just a band of metal that caught the dying light. Catherine Sterling, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Will you marry me? For a moment she could not speak. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks. But she was smiling. Smiling so hard her face hurt. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Jake Morrison. I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Behind them, Tempest reared once, his cry echoing across the valley like a celebration. And in that perfect moment, with the man she loved and the horse that had brought them together, Catherine knew that some stories do not end in sorrow. Some stories end in joy. The wedding took place on a perfect autumn day. Golden leaves drifted down from the cottonwood trees, carpeting the ground like nature's own confetti. The entire valley had turned out, filling the Sterling Ranch with laughter and music and joy. Catherine wore a simple white dress, her mother's pearls around her neck. Jake wore his best shirt, the one he had been saving for an occasion worthy of it. The preacher stood before them, Bible in hand, speaking words about love and commitment and forever. But Catherine barely heard them. She was too busy looking at Jake, at the man who had ridden into her life on a tired horse and changed everything. When it came time for the vows, Jake's voice was steady. "I promise to stand beside you through every storm, to lift you when you fall, to love you when you are strong, and love you even more when you think you are weak. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your home, for as long as I draw breath." Sir Catherine's voice shook, but her words were sure. "I promise to trust you with my heart, my home, and my future. To be patient when you are stubborn and stubborn when you need someone to push back. I promise to grow old with you, to build a life with you, to face whatever comes with my hand in yours, forever." The preacher smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Jake did not need to be told twice. The crowd cheered. Tempest, standing at the fence in a place of honor, reared and called out, his voice carrying across the valley like a blessing. 5 years later, on a summer afternoon, a young cowboy rode onto the Sterling ranch. He was dusty and worn, with eyes that had seen too much hardship too young. He approached the main house slowly, hat in hand, uncertain of his welcome. Catherine met him on the porch. Jake came to stand beside her. "I heard you help people," the young man said. "People who have lost their way." Jake studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "We do not turn people away here," he said. "Not if they are honest about what they need." The young man's shoulders sagged with relief. "I am not much. Just someone who is better with horses than people." "Then you came to the right place." Jake extended his hand. "Welcome to the Sterling Ranch. Let us get you settled." As the sun dipped toward the mountains, Catherine watched her husband lead the young cowboy toward the bunkhouse. She thought about her own journey, the grief and the fear and the fire, and how it had all led here, to this moment, to this life. Tempest appeared beside her, his muzzle gray now with age, but his eyes still bright. "Look at us," Catherine said softly, stroking his neck. "Still standing, still fighting, still loving." The stallion nickered, a sound of agreement and contentment. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening wind, Catherine could have sworn she heard Thomas laughing, finally at peace, knowing his dream had survived. The Sterling Ranch was home. It always would be. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.